For decades, America fed the world. Corn from Kansas, wheat from Iowa, soybeans from Illinois. They called it feeding the planet, but hidden behind those smiling farmer commercials and aid programs was something far deeper, a quiet control game. Africa was the prize, a continent with 60% of the world's remaining arable land, yet somehow, always dependent on imported food. How is that possible? How can the world's most fertile continent still be waiting for shipments from Washington? The truth is that Africa's hunger has never been about soil. It's been about control. America's agricultural dominance was never just about crops. It was about influence. Every grain, every seed, every dollar spent in African agriculture came with strings-attached contracts, loans, policies. And for decades, Africa played along. But now, the script is changing. Across the continent, something powerful is happening. From the green valleys of Ethiopia to the savanna plains of Nigeria, from Ghana's cocoa belt to Kenya's new tech-driven farms, Africa is breaking free from American control of food. And Washington is watching and losing. This is the new agricultural war, and it's not fought with guns or missiles. It's fought with seeds, soil, and strategy. For decades, the United States has shaped how Africa farms, what Africa grows, and who profits from African land. Through aid programs like USAID and trade laws like AGOA, America positioned itself as the partner. But in truth, it was the referee and the player at the same time. U.S. corporations controlled seed patents. American NGOs pushed genetically modified crops that locked farmers into dependency. And every loan, every development partnership came with economic conditions that tilted the scales toward the West. Africa wasn't just trading crops, it was trading its freedom. But Africa didn't stay silent. A new generation of African leaders, scientists, and farmers began asking the questions America didn't want to hear. Why can't we feed ourselves? Why should African farmers pay royalties for seeds that grow on African land? Why must African nations import grain from countries that have less sunshine, less land, and less potential? Those questions became movements. And those movements became revolutions. In Ghana, young entrepreneurs are turning cocoa waste into organic fertilizer. In Kenya, digital farming apps are connecting small-scale farmers directly with buyers, skipping American middlemen. In Nigeria, local rice production has exploded, cutting imports by billions. Africa is no longer asking for aid, it's building systems that compete. And that's what scares Washington. Because for the first time in modern history, Africa is no longer just a market, it's a competitor. A competitor that grows its own food. A competitor that processes its own crops. A competitor that sells to Asia, to the Middle East, to itself without passing through the American system. You see, in geopolitics, food is power. Whoever controls food controls people. For decades, the U.S. used food aid as soft power, feeding nations, influencing governments, and shaping policies under the label of generosity. But Africa is learning that free food is never truly free. Every bag of USAID wheat carries a silent message: depend on us, stay small, stay manageable. And yet something changed when Africa realized that the same soil that grows aid crops could grow prosperity. Now African farmers are taking control. They are planting native seeds, building irrigation systems powered by solar energy, and using homegrown technology that doesn't need Western approval. This quiet revolution is spreading, faster than anyone in Washington expected. The American system is cracking. The more Africa invests in local agriculture, the weaker U.S. leverage becomes. And when you weaken U.S. control of food, you weaken U.S. control of policy. Because food isn't just what we eat, it's how nations survive. For decades, America convinced the world that African farming needed Western technology, but those technologies came with patents. Seeds that couldn't be replanted, chemicals that had to be bought year after year, tractors that broke down and could only be fixed with American parts. Africa was trapped in a system built to keep it dependent. But now African nations are flipping the script. They're investing in indigenous seeds that thrive naturally in local climates. They're refunding agro-processing industries that turn rock crops into finished products right there on African soil. They're trading regionally, using local currencies instead of dollars. For the first time in modern history, African farmers are not looking to Washington, they're looking to one another. Ghana is learning from Rwanda. Kenya is sharing tech with Nigeria. Ethiopia is exporting coffee without Western intermediaries. And that's what America didn't expect: unity. Because as Africa unites agriculturally, its economic independence grows. And when Africa can feed itself, it no longer needs to kneel for aid. That's the real threat, not to food security, but to power security. Today, China and Russia are stepping in not with free food, but with infrastructure deals, fertilizer plants, and technology transfers. Instead of donations, Africa is getting partnerships, and that shift from dependency to partnership is rewriting the rules of global agriculture. America is losing this war not because it's weak, but because Africa finally realized how strong it really is. This is no longer the Africa of the 1980s that waited for food ships. This is a new Africa, young, confident, ambitious. An Africa that refuses to be the world's supplier of raw materials or the receiver of leftovers. An Africa that plants its own destiny, waters it with its own sweat, and reaps with its own hands. America once used the phrase feed the world. But now the world is watching as Africa prepares to feed itself and others. The agricultural war is no longer about hunger. It's about independence, and for the first time Africa is winning. For half a century, American agribusiness stood like a giant over African soil. Names like Monsanto, Cargill, and DuPont were whispered in ministries, signed in billion-dollar contracts, and printed across seed bags. These corporations weren't just selling technology, they were selling dependence. It started with a promise: we will help Africa grow more food, and who could say no to that? But what Africa received wasn't empowerment, it was entrapment. U.S. agribusiness introduced genetically modified seeds that promised higher yields but came with strings. Farmers couldn't replant those seeds, they had to buy new ones every year from the same companies. If they tried to reuse them, they risked lawsuits under international seed patent laws that the U.S. itself helped write. So every season, African farmers sent millions of dollars back to corporations in Missouri and Minnesota just to keep planting. This wasn't aid, it was economic colonization through agriculture. As years passed, the trap deepened, local seeds began disappearing. Traditional maize, millet, and sorghum varieties perfectly adapted to African climates were replaced by patented hybrids that required imported fertilizers and chemicals. Fertilizers that came, of course, from the same companies selling the seeds. This was the perfect cycle: dependency disguised as development. But the soil remembers, and Africa never forgets. By the mid-2010s, African scientists and activists began to push back. In Burkina Faso, Monsanto's genetically modified cotton promised farmers better yields. Instead, it damaged fiber quality, leading to massive losses. The government terminated the contract, banned GMO cotton, and returned to local varieties. In Kenya, activists filed lawsuits demanding full transparency about imported GM maize, arguing it endangered local ecosystems and farmer autonomy. In Ghana, public protests stopped a proposed seed bill that would have given multinationals full ownership of local seed patents. Everywhere, Africans started asking the same question: why are we paying foreign corporations to grow food on our own land? That question became a movement. As American agribusiness struggled to hold its influence, African innovators stepped in. In Nigeria, a new wave of agri-tech startups emerged, platforms like Thrivey Agric and FarmCrowdy connecting local farmers directly with investors and buyers. In Kenya, M-Farm allowed smallholders to check market prices instantly, ending decades of exploitation by middlemen. In Rwanda, drone technology began mapping farmlands for precision irrigation. None of these required U.S. corporations. They were 100% African-built, African-owned, and African-led. And that's when Washington started to panic, because for the first time Africa was creating value without asking for permission. The U.S. had long relied on trade deals like AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, to maintain leverage. It offered free access to American markets in exchange for political alignment and structural reforms. But the fine print was clear. U.S. agricultural exports to Africa would remain unrestricted, while African products faced quality restrictions, tariffs, and hidden regulations. Africa was told to open its markets while the U.S. protected its own, and for years that imbalance worked. Until 2020. When the pandemic hit and global trade slowed, African nations discovered something extraordinary. They could survive without U.S. imports. They could grow, process, and trade locally. That realization broke the illusion of American indispensability. Today, Africa's agricultural partnerships are shifting east and south. China, India, Brazil, and Russia are investing not in dependency but in production, building fertilizer factories, grain storage facilities, and research centers. BRICS nations are supporting Africa's local supply chains, not just exporting products. In 2024, Nigeria launched a massive fertilizer plant funded partly by domestic investors and BRICS partners, reducing dependency on American imports by 40%. In Ghana, Chinese-funded irrigation systems are helping small-scale farmers double yields, and South Africa is exporting processed agricultural products across the continent, keeping profits inside Africa. The shift is undeniable, and America's grip is slipping. Washington calls it competition, but Africa calls it independence. Behind closed doors, American think tanks warn that Africa is falling under the influence of China and Russia. But what they really mean is America is losing control. For decades, the U.S. shaped African food systems through aid programs and policy influence. But now, African nations are shaping their own with or without Western blessing. America's greatest fear isn't that Africa trades with China. It's that Africa might one day feed itself and others. A self-sufficient Africa means no dependency on U.S. food aid, no leverage through hunger, no political influence via agricultural loans, and that is a direct threat to America's global soft power. Because control over food is control over the future. In 2025, Africa's food exports to Asia surpassed imports from the U.S. for the first time in history. The continent that once relied on aid is now selling organic produce, coffee, and grains to emerging markets, setting new records in agricultural revenue. This shift isn't a headline in Washington, it's a quiet panic, because once Africa becomes the world's next food basket, it no longer plays by American rules. In villages across Malawi, Tanzania, and Senegal, small farmers are reviving indigenous seeds, maize that survives drought, sorghum that grows without chemical inputs, yams that feed generations. These are the seeds America couldn't patent, the seeds of freedom. Every harvest now represents more than food, it represents victory. Over decades of dependency. U.S. corporations once dictated how Africa should plant, harvest, and trade. Now Africa is dictating how it will prosper. America lost the agricultural war not because of sanctions nor coups nor revolutions, but because Africa woke up. Africa realized that the real war was never about who grows the most crops, it was about who controls the roots, and now Africa controls its own. The age of agricultural dependence is over. Africa is no longer the world's farm. Africa is the world's future. Every revolution begins quietly. No marching armies, no breaking news, just the sound of seeds hitting soil one by one. That's how Africa's silent revolution began. While the world looked at Africa through the lens of poverty and aid, something powerful was happening in the background. A new generation of farmers was rising, not with guns but with knowledge. It started small. A farmer in northern Ghana deciding to save her local maize seeds instead of buying imported ones. A cooperative in Nigeria rejecting chemical-heavy American fertilizers and turning to organic compost made from their own crops. A youth startup in Kenya using mobile apps to sell vegetables directly to city markets, cutting out foreign distributors entirely. These were not random acts. They were the first steps in Africa's agricultural independence movement. For decades, the story was simple. America fed Africa. But now Africa was feeding itself and the world. In the villages, farmers began to share knowledge: how to save native seeds, how to irrigate efficiently, how to process crops locally. These weren't billion-dollar programs. They were community revolutions passed from one hand to another, one generation to the next, and slowly the results started to show. In Nigeria, local rice production doubled within 5 years. In Ethiopia, coffee exports surged, powered by locally owned cooperatives. In Ghana, new food factories began packaging African produce for African supermarkets. Africa was breaking free not by fighting the system but by outgrowing it. In the old system, the U.S. had the advantage of machines, data, and infrastructure. But this time, Africa fought back with innovation: drones that mapped farmlands, AI-driven weather apps predicting rain cycles, blockchain tracking that ensured fair pay for farmers. These tools didn't come from Silicon Valley, they came from Nairobi, Lagos, Kigali, from the minds of Africans who understood the soil better than anyone else. Africa wasn't just catching up, it was creating a new model for the world. This was the turning point. The U.S. lost control not because of politics but because Africa's youth refused to stay hungry in the digital age. They turned agriculture into business, they turned soil into wealth, and they turned farming into power. Washington used to define food power as the ability to feed others. Africa redefined it as the ability to feed yourself first. For years, food was a weapon used to influence nations, to shape votes, to buy loyalty. But now, Africa's independence was built on something deeper: self-sufficiency. In countries like Senegal, government programs began teaching young people modern farming instead of sending them abroad to seek jobs. In Uganda, schools integrated agriculture into education, teaching children to see soil not as struggle but as opportunity. This is Africa's quiet genius. It doesn't need to fight to win. It just needs to grow. When Africa began reclaiming its food systems, women stood at the center. In villages across Kenya, Mali, and Zambia, women's cooperatives took charge of seed preservation, microfinancing, and market distribution. They became the real generals of this agricultural war, organizing, educating, and producing. They turned kitchens into boardrooms and farmlands into empires. The U.S. aid agencies once called them beneficiaries. Today, they are owners. The greatest victory came not from modern machines but from ancient memory. Africa returned to its roots literally. Old farming methods once dismissed as primitive proved to be the key to sustainable growth. Crop rotation, organic composting, seasonal, water preservation. These practices, passed down through ancestors, outperformed imported systems designed for Western climates. It was poetic justice, the same wisdom once ignored by colonizers now saving the continent from dependency. Africa's strength was never lost, it was buried under the noise of modernization, and now it has been reborn. While America was losing ground, Africa was building new bridges. Partnerships with Brazil, India, and China offered technology without control. Deals with Russia included training African scientists instead of sending foreign consultants. Regional bodies like AFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area, connected local farmers to a 1.4 billion person market without ever needing the dollar. Africa was creating its own food map, one that didn't point toward Washington. In Washington, they called it losing influence. In Africa, it was called gaining independence. U.S. analysts still write reports warning that Africa is drifting toward China. But they miss the point. Africa isn't drifting anywhere. Africa is standing still, finally rooted in its own soil. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about choosing sovereignty. By 2030, Africa is projected to be the largest food-producing continent on Earth. Its farmers will feed over 2.5 billion people. Its agribusiness industry will be worth over $1 trillion. And that's not wishful thinking, it's already happening. Ethiopia exports coffee to Europe. Kenya sells avocados to China. Nigeria feeds West Africa with its own rice. Ghana processes chocolate for the world. For the first time, the global food chain runs through Africa, not around it. This revolution is not just about economics, it's about identity. Africa is rediscovering that feeding your people is a sacred duty, not a favor. That to grow food on your land is to protect your future. And that hunger is not just physical, it's the hunger for respect, for ownership, for dignity. The world called it the agricultural war, but for Africa it was always a war for the soul. And so the story comes full circle. Once America fed Africa to control it. Now Africa feeds itself to free itself. The same soil that once grew dependency now grows destiny. The same hands that once begged now build. The same fields once exploited now stand as symbols of sovereignty. This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where Africa's strength is measured not by foreign approval, but by its own harvest. Africa doesn't need permission to rise. It just needs rain, soil, and will. And now it has all three. For generations, the world looked at Africa as a field, a place to plant influence, harvest resources, and feed foreign dreams. But now, the soil has spoken. The earth that once bent under the weight of foreign hands now breathes freedom again. And the roots, those deep African roots, are reclaiming what was always ours. The right to feed our people, our way. This is more than a story about farming. This is a story about power, because whoever controls food controls the future. And for the first time in a long time, that control is shifting south. The United States spent decades positioning itself as the world's breadbasket, the supplier, the savior. But while Washington debated policy and sanctions, Africa quietly planted something stronger than crops: confidence. Today, the African farmer is no longer a symbol of struggle but of strategy. He doesn't wait for aid. He doesn't depend on donations. He builds, innovates, and feeds nations. She, the African woman, stands tall, with hands in the soil and vision in her eyes. She is the mother of a movement, turning fields into factories and farms into freedom. Together, they represent something unstoppable, a continent that remembers who it is. In trying to help, America forgot one truth: you can't outgrow people who are born from the soil itself. For every policy, every loan, every dependency program, Africa found a way to adapt, rebuild, and rise. The more America tried to feed Africa, the more Africa learned how to feed itself. The more they spoke of poverty, the more Africa's potential became undeniable. They called us developing. We called it evolving. They called it aid. We called it awakening. They called it control. We called it rebirth. Make no mistake, this is Africa's century. A century not built on charity but on cultivation. Not on pity but on partnership. Not on dependence but on dignity. The U.S. may still have its satellites, its corporations, its influence, but Africa now has something money can't buy: the will to grow, the unity to sustain, and the vision to lead. Because when the African soil speaks, it doesn't whisper, it roars. It tells the story of kings and queens, farmers and warriors, dreamers and doers. It reminds the world that Africa was never behind, it was just planted, waiting for the right season. And now that season has arrived, from the deserts of Mali to the green valleys of Rwanda, from the cocoa fields of Ghana to the rice plains of Nigeria. Africa's soil is awake. It's no longer just growing crops. It's growing confidence, wealth, and destiny. The war for Africa's future will not be fought with guns or gold. It will be fought with seeds, soil, and self-belief, and this time, Africa is ready. The United States may have lost Africa's agricultural war. But Africa has won something far greater: its independence of purpose. Because when Africa feeds itself, the world will finally understand the soil remembers who it belongs to. The soil remembers who it belongs to. But it also remembers who forgot it. For years, Africa's farmlands cried silently, overplowed, underpaid, and overlooked. But the rain is back now, and this time it doesn't fall for the West, it falls for us. This is not revenge, it's restoration. A restoration of pride, a restoration of purpose, a restoration of Africa's original rhythm, the rhythm of self-sufficiency. The truth is, America didn't just lose Africa's agricultural war, it lost Africa's trust. Because you cannot claim to be a friend while you feed someone's hunger with one hand and steal their harvest with the other. For too long, Africa's farmers were taught dependency disguised as diplomacy, loans wrapped in kindness, a draft in control. But Africa has unwrapped the lie, and what lies beneath is clear. Our hunger was never for food, it was for freedom. You see, when Africa talks about independence, it's not politics, it's survival. We are the youngest continent in the world, the richest in natural resources, the most diverse in climate and culture. But none of that matters if we cannot feed ourselves. That's why this new agricultural revolution is not just about crops, it's about control. Control of our soil, control of our seeds, control of our story. Because whoever tells your story owns your future. And for too long, that story was written in Washington. Now it's being rewritten in Lagos, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Accra. This is not a copy of the Western dream, it's an African reality. The next generation of African billionaires won't come from oil or gold, they'll come from agriculture, from cassava fields in Nigeria, from cocoa farms in Ghana, from smart irrigation projects in Egypt, from maize technology startups in Kenya. The world may not be ready for it, but Africa is no longer waiting for permission. We are the producers, we are the innovators, we are the future, and the United States, for all its wealth and wisdom, can only watch as Africa does what it should have done decades ago. Feed itself first. To the rest of the world watching, don't mistake Africa's silence for weakness. Don't mistake our humility for ignorance, and don't mistake our cooperation for submission. Africa doesn't need saving. Africa needs respect. We welcome partnerships, not puppeteers. We want trade, not traps. We demand fairness, not favors. Because the new Africa will no longer trade its future for fertilizer, no longer sell its sovereignty for sustainability, no longer beg for rain when it already has rivers of potential. The world must understand, Africa's rise is not an alternative, it's an inevitable. And as this century unfolds, historians will look back at this moment not as the time the US lost Africa's agricultural war, but as the time Africa won its independence again. This time with seeds, not swords. Because revolutions don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear straw hats and muddy boots. Sometimes they speak softly in the language of rainfall and roots. Sometimes they fight quietly with harvests instead of hashtags. And sometimes they win not by taking power, but by taking ownership. The soil is more than land, it's memory, it's sacrifice, it's hope. The same soil that was once exploited now holds the blueprint of our redemption. And the day Africa finally understands its worth, no superpower, not even America, will be able to contain its growth.